And it goes to the guitar solo. I don't know that one note for note. I lived in a time where you learn stuff off cassettes and no YouTube, and you have to rely on your ear, and then you find out later on that all the stuff you thought you were playing note for note was really not note for note. You see a lot of better players on YouTube who just break things down, and yeah, great stuff. But my muscle memory kind of goes back to the way I learned things originally. Anyways, yeah, Somebody Get Me a Doctor from Van Halen off of Van Halen 2. And that song is chock full of very cool Edisms from the volume swell stuff that I just kind of played in that. Slowly bringing the chord up with the volumes after striking the chord. And there are a few other things in there too that are just great things that Ed always had in his arsenal throughout his career. He's, of course, most known for his lead work amongst a lot of players, but his rhythm work is just so interesting and phenomenal. Almost, I would say, probably equally as good. My name's Elton. How you doing? This is Elton's 15. Welcome to the next installation here of me going through and recapping Alex Van Halen's book, which is called Brothers. It's about his brother, Eddie Van Halen, and this is Chapter 8. So let's begin with Chapter 8. So it starts off with him talking about Ted Templeman bringing them into Sunset Sound, which is a recording studio in 1977. And it is in that studio that they meet Don Landy, who plays a big part in Van Halen's backdrop in terms of studio stuff for the next several albums up until, Don Landy lasted until OU812. So we're talking Van Halen 1, Van Halen 2, Women and Children First, after that, Fair Warning, Diver Down, 1984, 5150, and then finally that last album that he did with him, which was OU812. That's quite a long span. I mean, he was with them for quite a while. That's a lot of albums. But anyways, they first meet Don Landy, who is an engineer, a brilliant guy by all accounts. He is he became Eddie Van Halen's right-hand man for quite a while. Like I said, throughout those albums, it was him and Don, and it was Don that helped them really put together 5150 Studios in his backyard to record 1984, but that's later on down the line. Anyways, so Don Landy, as far as impression-wise for Alex Van Halen, Alex wasn't too impressed in terms of like what Don was expecting of him. So recording Van Halen 1, their first album, they were thinking, and they were talking, Ed and Al were thinking, this is going to sound like Led Zeppelin. Woo, we're going to really sound massive. And so time to record the drums, and Don Landy's telling Alex Van Halen, hey man, you got to take, with the drum, there's a skin on top and a skin on bottom, and when you hit it, it has a certain resonant quality to it. And he's, okay, we're going to take all the bottom heads off your drums. And he's like, what are you talking about? Like Ginger Baker, Keith Moon, John Bonham, they don't do that. How are we going to get this massive bombastic sound? Well, they were not to achieve that bombastic sound. They were to achieve what we know was the Van Halen 1 sound, which is beloved by so many. But Al was not impressed with the sound. Neither was Eddie. And I guess Don did not mic, right? You get a full drum set. When you're recording, you got microphones on everything, right? All the toms, the snare, and the cymbals. And at that point, I think Al was playing a double bass drum, so there's two kick drums. And Don did not mic one of the two kicks, as he mentions in the book. And Al said that he just drank and obeyed Don. As a way to kind of remediate the tension that he was having in his mind about not having the drums done to what he thought would be the drums being recorded that way. He went on to say Ed just wanted to play live, And so Don and Ted Templeman were fine. Yeah, I mean, you play phenomenal, so let's do the things you're most comfortable with. So for Ed, they just kind of let him play live without any overdubs, meaning that he'd be tracking with the band, they'd be playing live, and then Eddie Van Halen would go back and would layer a guitar solo. He would play the song and play the backing chords to the song as they played it live, and would go back and cut guitar solos only for a couple songs. He did that for Jamie's Crying. He did that for Ice Cream Man, and he also did that for Running with the Devil. But everything else is live. So those solos and those songs for the rest of the album are just straight on through, which is unheard of today. But such a vibe, so cool. They recorded 25 songs, and from those 25 songs, they cherry-picked throughout their career with David Lee Roth. Of course, coming up with new material for each album, but a good portion of those songs would go on to make their way to Van Halen albums, even, seeds of those songs. And so they picked the best out of the 25, and that became the first album. Al mentions in Chapter 8 that he loves that Van Halen was so DIY, do-it-yourself. And he mentioned that specifically with, the intro to Running with the Devil is car horns. And I got my setup here, so let's listen to that real quick. So this is open air, but that sound, if you're not familiar with it, is the beginning of Running with the Devil. This right here. That's car horns. I think it's 3 car horns. One they pulled out of like a Volvo, a Volkswagen, and something else. I'm not sure exactly the makes and models of what the horns were pulled out of in terms of what cars they were pulled out of. But they tied them all together, and they used to use that as a sound effect live. So they would hook up the horns, and Michael Anthony or somebody would press a button, and the car horns would go like live. And if you listen to any bootleg tapes of them in the clubs, you will sometimes hear car horns just being fired off in between songs. So they took that, brought it into the studio, had them fire off, and then through the magic of studio wizardry, slowed them down and got them into pitch with the song. And that's the beginning of Run with the Devil. It sounds like a spaceship landing or something. Well, that's car horns. And the fact that they used to use flash pots, so the car horns being hooked up together live, the flash pots that they use, and he goes on to say he loves the fact that there was, that do-yourself kind of attitude, and same thing with Eddie Van Halen's pedal board. And so when we talk about pedal boards, let me go off camera for a second. So this is what we refer to as a guitar pedal, and this will manipulate the sound of a guitar when being played. It adds textures and sort of sound effecty kind of stuff. This particular pedal, called the MXR Phase script logo, this is a reissue. When they were first created in the 1970s, they didn't have this LED. This is not plugged in, but this is featured heavily on Van Halen 1 and used it quite a lot. But his pedal board with all these effects was attached to a piece of plywood. And when Van Halen would open up for, Ted Nugent or Journey and stuff, Ted and like Neil Young couldn't believe that this, kid is getting these phenomenal sounds. And look what he's using, just very primitive stuff and kicking butt with it. Al just loved that. I love that too. That's pretty cool. So they recorded Van Halen 1, I think it was in 2 or 3 weeks. When it came time to record vocals or vocal harmonies, Ted was very influential on shaping Roth's sound and worked really hard with him, but also with Michael Anthony and Eddie Van Halen. He was looking for like early Beach Boys kind of sound. And if you listen to the background harmonies off that album, any of the songs that are featured, that quality to Michael Anthony and Eddie Van Halen's voice blended together, that's the sound. That's equally as valid as the drum sound or the guitar sound or anything else that's making up the song. It is part of the song. And as far as Al's concerned, they didn't want Beach Boys. They wanted Led Zeppelin. But anyways, it still turned out awesome and great. Well, while they were cutting the backing vocals, Al goes on to tell a funny story that he went to sort of a rehab of sorts. He realized he needed to get in shape for the tour. And so he went to a place that specialized in getting people to stop smoking and weight loss. And so he went there and he was very specific that he only wanted to quit smoking And he said when he went there, the place smelled of like dingy cigarettes, like really bad, and posters of people with tracheotomies. And, he did that and saw it to its end, and he said it worked. Well, it may have only worked for that first tour, because subsequent tours and stuff, video footage, you see Alex Van Halen smoking for quite a while. But maybe for the beginning of the tour, it worked out pretty good. Ted Templeman, when he was recording David Lee Roth's voice, was quite worried that Dave wasn't going to be able to cut it, that the quality of his voice just wasn't up to snuff. And so there was hints that Sammy Hagar would replace David Lee Roth on Van Halen 1. How crazy is that? Now, a backstory to that is the band that Sammy Hagar was in at the time was called Montrose. And Ted Templeman had done their first, I think, 2 albums. And so he knew Sammy really well. And with Dave not panning out the way he was hoping, the idea was floated with Sammy. And then Dave, as far as Dave not being on, I can't imagine it. But Al was like, listen, we showed up with him. We're leaving with him. We're indivisible, as he put it in the book. And so they stuck with Roth, and it's a good thing they did. I mean, Roth brought a lot. His physicality, his charisma, and even his lyrics. Al gives him great props for his lyrics. And so that idea of indivisible and sticking together as a unit was sort of a theme earlier in the book, the chapters about Jan Van Halen, the Van Halen brothers' dad, saying you're stronger together as units. And so that applied here for sure. The label, as they were recording Van Halen 1, said no more clubs, no more playing out in clubs. We're just going to have you guys recording and sit for a while. And so they did. For 6 months, they were making, I think, $83.83 per month, which was not enough for them, but they somehow made it through. The album, again, was made in 2 or 3 weeks. Dave kind of cleaned up his act vocally. And when Ted was trying, get him to do vocal lessons, which he did, and he also stopped smoking, I guess. And then Ted cutting vocals one time. Dave, what have you done? Well, Dave's like, I'm trying to watch what I eat and stuff like that. And he goes, no, go out, go eat a cheeseburger, go smoke a joint, and come back. And that's a funny story that has kind of predated this book, but Al retells it there, which I thought was pretty funny. The first album cost $54,000 to make, which is incredible. And I'm going to pull from the book real quick on page 103 to 104. I think it's a quote from Ted Templeman as far as what his impressions were at the time. He said, during that time, the songs team came together just like that, Ted wrote. Ed might play some new parts he'd written. I'd hear something I'd like, so I'd stop him and say, hey, wait a second. I'd dig into my notebook and say something like, hey, remember that descending riff from that shuffle tune? Let's put it right here. That part you're working on now. What do you guys think? Those guys almost always knew exactly what I was referencing. If Ed didn't remember, then Al knew how to jar his memory. Then we'd work on rearranging the songs in question. After we get a new arrangement worked up, Dave would write an improved melody and often update his lyrics. So Ted was very impressed that they were pretty pliable, that they would take his suggestions, which as the years went on, happened a little less and less. In 1984, it was sort of a breaking point, but pretty moldable at this point. Ted thought Van Halen was great. Ed's virtuosity, Al's power, Dave's smarts, those Van Halen harmonies of Mike and Ed, youthful, again, carrying the Beach Boys vibe, and Al not being so happy, wanted more Led Zeppelin. And again, when he and Ed listened to some of the early takes of Van Halen 1, they listened to it in a car, and of course Ed and Al drove together, they lived together, and they discussed how upset that they were that the sounds weren't heavy enough. They wanted it to be heavy like Led Zeppelin. But anyways, he's very grateful, Al is, that Ted decided to include Eruption, which was Eddie Van Halen's unaccompanied guitar solo on that, and that it's a masterpiece, and that he recognized it as a masterpiece. He gives Ted props because he thought that the record company, given its power, wouldn't allow that because you can't dance to a guitar solo. But Ted was like, to heck with it, let's include it, and he did, and he's super proud of that. Anyways, before the album was released, Eddie Van Halen played a version of "You Really Got Me" to some friends, and those friends were in a band, and I think it was the band Angel. And Angel quickly, I think they were signed, looked to go in the studio and cut their own version of "You Really Got Me" and put it out before Van Halen. And that caused quite a stir. Ed got in a little bit of trouble with that, and it forced Van Halen to release "You Really Got Me" as their first single. instead of an original song, which did not sit well with Alex, but they did it anyways. The cover of the Van Halen album was not supposed to be this. The idea of punk being the number one sort of commodity at the time, they were going with something more like this, and this is backwards, but like that kind of vibe. And I don't know if you guys can see this here, but there's a very weird picture back there of what was supposed to be the Van Halen cover. It's just the boys kind of looking like they're street tough, and that didn't fly. Thank goodness they hired a guy named Elliot Gilbert, who took them to the Whiskey A Go Go, and they shot the shots that became the Van Halen cover here. So that's where they were shot. Pretty awesome. I mean, this is so iconic. Then David Dang, B-H-A-N-G, designed this here, which is the VH with the wings. Al loved it because it represented, like to him, Led Zeppelin's Achilles with the wings and stuff. That was supposed to be on the first album cover, but it wasn't. They're not punk. They're not punk. They're not punk. Van Halen has too much humor and a bunch of other things that go along with it that just separate them from punk. But they were in the age of punk, and Al said he can't blame the record company for trying to push them in that direction, but that wasn't them. Their last show was at the Pasadena Civic. They packed in a couple thousand kids. Ted Templeman went to the show. He likened it to like, oh, wow, this is like seeing the Beatles. The first album hasn't even dropped yet, and look how popular and how much they draw. So it was so much excitement for that band. Before the first album was put out, they actually put out, this is a reproduction, red vinyl. And if you'll notice, you got Elmer Fudd, Porky Pig at the center from Looney Tunes, the Van Halen sticker on the back. But this was out before the first album. Trying to put it back in its sleeve. There we go. And so there it is. I got this a couple years ago. Way better. Thank goodness. It doesn't have all the songs on that the original red vinyl, but it has a few songs. Eddie Van Halen ended up waking up Al at 2 o'clock in the morning because You Really Got Me was finally on the radio, and they finally realized their dream. This is awesome. They ended up going on the road for 11 months, that tour. It's not like he says touring is today. They had friends help him out. Ed had his best friend, Rudy, roadie for him. Al had Greg Emerson roadie for him. And Al and Ed drove the truck for the touring truck during that time. Chicago, February 1978, February 28th, they opened up for Journey in Montrose. Yeah, they expected kind of better amenities on the road, but they were used to crappy stuff, so they didn't have a problem adjusting, but they expected better, from the tour bus to just the facilities to playing with the guys. They were the opening act, so they were way out front of the stage, and the other band's equipment was behind them, so it didn't leave much for stage stuff. Van Halen 1 got on the chart after a month, up to 19 on the chart, which is pretty cool. Anyways, as far as the book is concerned, that's mostly what Chapter 8 is about. There is stories in Chapter 8 where they talk about some mischievous acts that they do. I'm not going to highlight them here, kind of leave them as a surprise, maybe to get you to go check out the book yourself if you like. But again, it's just a recap. I'm trying not to detail every last part of it, although I could, but trying to leave a little bit of mystery here. Anyways, I'm Elton. This is Elton's 15. Thank you for joining me for Chapter 8, Alex Van Halen's book, Brothers. Thank you.